when Franklin Delano Roosevelt became the 32nd President of the United States in 1933. He inherited a country that was collapsing into itself. Stock prices had fallen more than 80% from their peak just 4 years earlier. Unemployment was over 25%, and people were losing their homes, their farms, and their very sense of security. As one writer put it, no nation in history ever suffered so complete a disillusionment with its leaders and its institutions. But while Hoover had been unable to turn things around, Roosevelt was up to the task. Over the next 4 years, he led America out of the Great Depression and established the foundations for the modern American state. This is the incredible story of Roosevelt's revolution. Franklin D. Roosevelt was born into wealth. In fact, when he graduated from Harvard Law School, he ranked 14th from the bottom of his class. What he lacked in brains, though, he made up for in personality. And it didn't take long for him to make a name for himself in the political world. After serving as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President Woodrow Wilson, Roosevelt went on to become governor of New York, and it was in this role that he really came into his own. Though New York had been hit particularly hard by the stock market crash of 1929, Roosevelt refused to let the crisis paralyze him or the state. Instead, he got to work implementing a series of progressive reforms that improved the lives of millions of Americans and set the stage for his run for the White House. With the economy still in free fall, however, many people felt that the only thing Roosevelt could do was make things worse. Even his own brother-in-law described him as a bold, reckless type who might land us in the poorhouse. But these critics had failed to read the polls, which showed that more than 2/3 of Americans believed that the country was headed in the wrong direction and that they wanted a leader who would shake things up. And so, in what would become one of the greatest landslides in American history, voters sent Roosevelt and his New Deal for the White House. The New Deal was essentially a series of domestic programs and public works projects designed to get America back on its feet. The first ones he introduced in his first 100 days in office were aimed at providing relief, recovery, and reform. Relief measures such as the Federal Emergency Relief Administration provided direct aid to the unemployed, while recovery measures such as the Agricultural Adjustment Act sought to stimulate production and full employment. Reform measures such as the Securities and Exchange Commission aimed to prevent another stock market crash. Initially, these programs were met with resistance from Congress, who felt that they were too expensive and would create a dangerous precedent for future presidents. But Roosevelt was not deterred. In his first inaugural address, he famously declared, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," and proceeded to push through his agenda with remarkable speed. By the end of his first term, unemployment rate had fallen from 25% to 16%, and industrial production had increased by 60%. Fortunately, though, just as the economy began to recover, the stock market crashed again, which led to a second New Deal in 1935. Though similar to the first, this package of reforms was even more ambitious. It included the Social Security Act, which established the first federal old age pension program in the United States, as well as the Works Progress Administration, which employed millions of Americans to build roads, bridges, airports, and public buildings across the country. By the time Roosevelt's second term rolled around, the economy was booming. GDP had nearly doubled, and industrial production had quadrupled. And though some critics argued that these gains had come at the expense of American liberty, there was little evidence of this. In fact, as historian Robert K. Merton put it, the New Deal was not so much a threat to American liberty as an expansion of it. In addition to introducing sweeping reforms, Roosevelt also restored hope and confidence in the American people. Up until his election, presidents had always come from the wealthy elite, which meant that most Americans felt that the government was run by a group of powerful interests that didn't have their best interests at heart. But Roosevelt was different. Not only was he one of them, but he was also willing to speak their language. Before the advent of television, radio was the primary means of communicating with the masses. And Roosevelt was a master of the radio. His fireside chats were informal talks he gave over the airwaves in which he discussed important issues facing the country and solicited the American people's support for his policies. More than half of all American families owned a radio by 1936, and it's estimated that some 60 million people tuned in to hear Roosevelt's speeches. Through this medium, he was able to connect with ordinary Americans and explain why his policies benefited them, and it wasn't just what he said, but how he said it. Roosevelt was famous for his folksy charm, and his uncanny ability to make people feel like he was talking directly to them. "I see a new future for our country," he once told his listeners. "A future which will bring us closer together, not only as citizens of one nation, but as human beings." As the country moved toward recovery, however, some began to worry that Roosevelt was becoming too powerful. His unprecedented use of the bully pulpit had turned the presidency into a kind of fourth estate, which was undermining the authority of Congress and the courts. But Roosevelt didn't seem to care. He was too busy passing legislation, appointing judges, and regulating industries. In fact, he seemed to relish the fight. As he told one advisor, "I don't want to go down in history as a man who shrunk from a fight." But while Roosevelt was willing to go toe-to-toe with the opposition, he never forgot that he was a politician first and foremost. And so he was careful to avoid any missteps that might cost him the support of the people. He knew that he owed his success to them, and he worked tirelessly to ensure that they re-elected him. After winning a second term in a landslide, Roosevelt turned his attention to an even bigger prize, a third term in office. At the time, this was unheard of. No president had ever served more than 2 terms. But Roosevelt was convinced that he could win a record-breaking third term and use it to finish the job he started. Unfortunately, he never got the chance. In 1945, he suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak. 4 months later, he died. Though Roosevelt is no longer with us, his legacy lives on in the laws and institutions he helped create. The Social Security Act remains the foundation of our retirement system and the works. Progress administration left behind a remarkable legacy of public works. In fact, there's a good chance that you've benefited from Roosevelt's reforms in some way, even if you don't realize it. That's because Roosevelt's revolution didn't just change the way government works, it changed the way we think about government. Before Roosevelt, most Americans saw the federal government as something to be avoided. It was big, impersonal, and unresponsive to the needs of the people. But Roosevelt's reforms proved that the federal government could be a force for good. It could provide relief in times of need, recover the economy from a deep depression, and reform the financial system to prevent another crash. Of course, there are limits to what government can accomplish. And in some areas, such as the economy, less is definitely more. But in other areas, such as social welfare, more can be better. And it's precisely this attitude that has allowed the United States to become one of the most generous countries in the world. When it comes to helping those in need, for example, the United States is the largest provider of foreign aid in the world. And it's no coincidence that the U.S. is also the richest country in the world. We can afford to be generous because we know that when push comes to shove, our government will take care of us. And that's a luxury that many countries simply don't enjoy. If there's anything we've learned from the past century, it's that good leaders are essential to the well-being of our society. When leaders are willing to speak plainly, govern boldly, and care deeply, they can help us weather even the most difficult storms. Though we may disagree with their policies, we can trust that they have our best interests at heart. It's a rare quality, and we should appreciate it when we find it. Thank you for watching this episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe for more content.